At dawn on September 13, 1942, Corporal Walter Burak crouched low in a shallow fighting hole on a grassy ridge near Guadalcanal, staring into the dim jungle haze that clung to the south. He had not slept in more than 36 hours. His hands trembled from exhaustion, his throat burned with thirst, and his M1 rifle felt as heavy as a sack of wet concrete. The heat, even at sunrise, already pressed against him like a blanket soaked in boiling water. Ahead of him, the ridge rose slowly toward the hump of ground the Marines simply called Hill 123, a narrow spine of coral and kunai grass hardly 1,000 yards long, waving gently in the morning breeze. By nightfall, that grass would hide thousands of enemy soldiers. Burak knew they would come again. Every man on the ridge knew it. And behind that ridge, less than a mile away, lay Henderson Field, a strip of dirt that suddenly meant everything in the Pacific War. The airstrip didn't look like much, just a reddish gash of crushed coral, a few half-buried revetments, and a handful of tired American aircraft. But that ragged patch of dirt was the hinge on which the entire Pacific theater now swung. Whoever controlled Henderson Field controlled the Solomon Islands. And whoever controlled the Solomons controlled the sea lanes between the United States and Australia. The Japanese understood that perfectly. They had already sent more than 3,000 men through some of the deadliest jungle on Earth to take it back. And standing in their way were only 840 Marines, exhausted raiders and parachute battalion veterans who were running low on ammunition, food, and strength. But they were still there. They were still breathing. And today they would have to hold. When dawn lit the ridge, Burak finally saw what the night had hidden. The slopes were carpeted with bodies, hundreds of Japanese soldiers lying broken and twisted in the grass. Some sprawled face up, frozen in mid-motion. Others lay curled on their sides, hands still clutching rifles slick with mud. Flies already circled in black, buzzing clouds as thick as smoke. The humid air reeked of blood, rotting vegetation, and spent cordite. Burak had seen death before, but never like this. The scene reminded him of the photographs he'd once seen of the First World War. Men strewn everywhere, stuck in whatever posture they happened to fall. Marines picked through the bodies, collecting weapons, checking for wounded enemies, pulling ammunition from the dead. But Burak barely watched them. He knew the truth. This was only the prelude. The real attack had not yet begun. For nearly a year, the Japanese had dominated the Pacific. They controlled a vast empire stretching from China to New Guinea. They had crushed every Allied force they had encountered. But Henderson Field was the thread that could unravel their entire defensive perimeter. From that one strip, American planes could slash their supply lines, harass their shipping, and defend the waters between America and Australia. If Japan lost it, they would lose the Solomons. If they lost the Solomons, their entire Pacific strategy would begin to crumble. Leading the Japanese attack was Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, a stern, 49-year-old veteran with decades of jungle warfare behind him. His 35th Infantry Brigade was among the best in the Imperial Army, trained in night fighting and ruthless assaults. Kawaguchi planned to approach the American perimeter from the dense jungle to the south, an area the Marines believed impassable. That was his advantage. He expected to strike in the darkness, when American aircraft could not fly and Marine lines were at their thinnest. In a single night, he intended to overwhelm the ridge, storm Henderson Field, and crush the entire American foothold on Guadalcanal. But Kawaguchi wasn't the only commander who recognized the ridge's importance. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson, had seen it days earlier and understood its meaning instinctively. A quiet, flinty Vermonter who had cut his teeth fighting guerrillas in Nicaragua and observing Japanese tactics in China, Edson could read terrain like a book. He knew the Japanese would come straight through that narrow, seemingly quiet strip of high ground. When others thought the area safe, Edson saw danger. When others planned to rest there, he prepared for battle. On September 11th, 2 days before the main assault, Edson moved his raiders and the surviving para-marines onto the ridge. His exhausted men had hoped for rest, but instead he ordered them to dig fighting holes, string wire, and fortify every inch of ground. They cursed quietly as they worked, but they obeyed. They trusted him. They had followed him through Tulagi's jungles and through weeks of bombing and shellfire. They would follow him now. Japanese bombers hammered the ridge throughout the day. That night, Japanese cruisers offshore pounded the Marines with shells that shredded trees and tossed dirt into the air in great geysers. Then came the first test attack, waves of infantry striking the raider positions, driving them back, trying to feel out the weakest points. Edson's men fell back deliberately, drawing the attackers into pre-planned killing zones, where Marine artillery clawed into the darkness with devastating accuracy. By dawn, the Marines still held the ridge. Barely. On the afternoon of September 13th, Edson ordered his men to pull back to a tighter defensive arc around Hill 123. He knew the next attack would be far bigger. He climbed onto a battered wooden grenade box so every man could see him. They gathered silently around him, their faces drawn, uniforms torn, bodies aching from days of combat. Edson did not give a dramatic speech. He simply told them the truth. Another attack was coming. He told them he needed one more night. Just one. Relief would come in the morning. Hold until then, he said. Hold for one more night. The men listened. They believed him. And they returned to their positions to prepare for hell. Night fell slowly, swallowed by thick clouds and heavy rain. Mud soaked the ridge. Marines shivered in their foxholes, fingers clutching rifles, eyes scanning the pitch-black jungle. At 18:30, the rumble of ship engines far offshore gave a few seconds of warning before Japanese destroyers opened fire. Shell after shell screamed overhead, bursting across the ridge in deafening crescendos of shock and flame. Marines pressed themselves into the earth as explosions hurled coral, wood, and body parts into the air. Corpsmen crawled blindly through the bombardment, dragging wounded men to safety. When the shelling finally ended, silence fell again, the kind of silence that seemed unnatural and cruel. Then the jungle erupted. 3,000 Japanese infantry charged up the ridge, appearing out of the darkness in a single, terrifying wave. Their battle cries rolled over the ridge like a physical force, echoing through the trees, shaking the air itself. The Marines opened fire. Machine guns laid sheets of red tracers across the grass. Rifles cracked in steady rhythm. Mortars thumped as shells arced overhead and burst among the attackers. But the Japanese kept coming. They ran through fire, through explosions, through their own dead, leaping over the bodies of comrades who had fallen seconds earlier. They plunged into the Marine lines like a tidal wave. The fighting became hand-to-hand almost immediately. Men grappled in the mud, stabbing with bayonets, slashing with knives, pummeling each other with rifle butts. The screams of wounded men mixed with the thunder of explosions and the metallic clicking of rifles cycling. Some fighting holes became small tombs, filled with bodies of Americans and Japanese tangled together. The right flank collapsed under sheer weight. A 200-yard gap opened in the line. Japanese soldiers surged through, racing toward Hill 123. If they reached the crest, the airfield would be open to them. The campaign, and perhaps the entire Pacific War, would be lost. Edson moved like a man possessed. He strode along the ridge, never more than a few yards from the front, fully exposed to enemy fire. Bullets snapped past his head. Grenades burst at his feet. Shrapnel whirled around him in invisible sheets. He did not duck. He did not pause. He shouted orders clearly, calmly, directing counterattacks, repositioning machine guns, sending reinforcements exactly where they were needed. His presence steadied every Marine who saw him. If Red Mike stood his ground, if he refused to yield an inch in the middle of that storm, then they could hold too. A forward observer named Tom Watson arrived at the front with his radio, calling artillery coordinates from a fighting hole so close to the Japanese that he could hear their officers shouting commands. He adjusted fire again and again, walking 105mm shells across the ridge until the explosions formed a wall of flame and dirt. Still the Japanese charged. Still the Marines fired. When ammunition began running low, Edson threw his reserves forward. Company B and Company C fixed bayonets and charged into the breach. The collisions were brutal. Marines and Japanese slammed together in the darkness, stabbing, shooting, clawing for every foot of ground. Slowly, the Marines pushed the attackers back. The line solidified once again. But the night was far from over. Japanese forces circled from the east, attempting to flank the raiders along the Lunga River. Machine gunners swung their barrels and fired until their hands blistered. When belts ran dry, they grabbed fresh ammo from the pouches of dead Marines. Again the line held. Around midnight, the rain finally stopped and the moon broke through the clouds, illuminating the ridge. The Marines could see fresh waves of Japanese infantry forming for another assault. Artillery observers seized the moment, calling down fire on the assembly areas before the troops could attack. Shells exploded among them, scattering formations and hurling bodies across the ground. Still, the Japanese did not stop. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Kawaguchi ordered his final, desperate charge, a massed assault of 3 battalions, thrown directly at Hill 123. The noise rose to a terrifying crescendo as thousands of men surged through the grass, racing uphill toward the exhausted Marines. The defenders fired everything they had left. Rifles cracked. Machine guns roared. Mortars exploded. Artillery pounded the slope. The ridge shook beneath their feet. The night sky flickered with muzzle flashes, turning the battlefield into a hellish strobe of light and shadow. And still the Japanese climbed. Hours passed. The battle blurred into one long scream of pain and gunfire. Men fought until they could no longer hold their weapons. They fought until their arms shook uncontrollably, until their ears rang, until they could barely stand. They fought because Edson asked them for one more night, and because somewhere behind them lay a dirt airstrip that could decide the fate of the world. When the sun finally rose on September 14th, the jungle was silent again. The slopes were buried in bodies, thousands of them. The Japanese assault had shattered itself against the ridge. Edson's raiders, who had been outnumbered nearly 4-1, still held Hill 123. Henderson Field remained in American hands. The Japanese retreat began before noon. The battle for the ridge, later known as Edson's Ridge, became one of the defining moments of the Guadalcanal campaign. It broke the momentum of Japanese forces, preserved America's foothold in the Pacific, and ensured that Henderson Field remained a dagger pointed at Japan's empire. Burak, who had started the day shivering in a muddy fighting hole, survived the night. Many of his friends did not. But the line had held because a handful of exhausted Marines refused to break, because their commander refused to let them, and because sometimes in war, one night can decide everything.